This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, you're really interested in this whole FDR and the New World Order thing, huh?
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
We got those notes you sent and that podcast episode. Pretty thought-provoking, I gotta say.
Definitely. It's more than just history,
It's like what could have been.
Exactly. What we're looking at here is FDR's big plan for peace after World War II.
And how that whole thing with Stalin went down.
Right, and how all that might have led to the Cold War. It's still debated today, if things had to happen that way.
Like a choose-your-own-adventure history lesson.
In a way.
So let's start with FDR himself. That podcast episode actually calls him one of America's most influential presidents.
Yeah, a bold statement for sure.
So what made his vision so different? What set him apart?
Well, he was trying to do something pretty radical. He wanted to shift global politics.
Like change the game completely?
Yeah, move away from that old might makes right idea, where the strongest just do whatever they want.
And go toward
A system based on international cooperation. He really believed in those organizations like the UN.
to prevent another war like World War II.
Exactly. And he truly believed in diplomacy, even with someone like Stalin.
Speaking of Stalin, how did FDR balance his idealism, wanting to work with everyone, with the reality of, well, Stalin?
That's where it gets tricky. While Churchill was deeply suspicious of Stalin, FDR really believed in personal diplomacy.
He saw him as a partner, really,
Almost. He definitely saw Stalin as necessary during the war.
to defeat Hitler, I guess.
Right. And FDR hoped that partnership could continue into peacetime.
Yeah.
He was willing to overlook a lot to keep Stalin on board.
Like with the Warsaw Uprising in '44, I was reading about that.
You mean when Stalin just crushed the Polish resistance?
Yeah. But FDR stayed silent.
He did. It's a big debate, even now.
Like, how much do we compromise on our values for the greater good?
That's the question.
And then there's this thing about FDR and imperialism.
Ah, yes.
Your notes mention this seeming contradiction.
He condemns European colonialism, which makes sense.
But at the same time,
The U.S. was expanding its own influence, especially in the Pacific and Latin America.
so was he just being a hypocrite?
It's not that simple.
Yeah.
What's fascinating is how this seeming contradiction might have actually made FDR more appealing to Stalin.
Hold on, you're saying they were both saying the same words but meaning totally different things.
Exactly. And this takes us to the Yalta Conference, February 1945.
Big three meet back to hash out the post-war world. What was at stake for FDR there?
Well, his main goal was getting the Soviets into the UN.
Even if it meant making some deals.
Even then, he was willing to recognize Soviet control in Manchuria, for example. And he knew the war against Japan wasn't over.
That was going to be tough.
Incredibly costly.
Yeah.
So getting Soviet help there was key for him.
But the notes mentioned he wasn't willing to compromise on everything.
Right. There was this idea of dividing Europe into spheres of influence.
The percentages agreement.
Yeah. FDR rejected that outright.
Why? Why was that a step too far?
It tells us a lot about how he saw the future of global politics. He didn't want to go back to that old way of doing things.
Dividing up territories.
Spheres of influence. He was pushing for something more collaborative, a true international system.
Which makes the compromises he did make even more interesting.
Like Poland?
Yeah, Poland. Stalin basically got his way there, right?
He did. It was a huge point of contention with Churchill, and it foreshadowed the Iron Curtain for sure.
It's almost sad how that declaration on liberated Europe, all about democracy, ended up being so weak against Stalin.
Yeah, powerful reminder that good intentions aren't always enough.
And all this is happening while FDR's health is failing.
Right, rapidly declining.
Just a month before he dies, he gives that speech to Congress, makes the case for the UN, America's chance to lead the world to peace.
A powerful speech.
But then he's gone, leaves Truman to deal with this whole mess.
It was a mess. The relationship with the Soviet Union was getting icy.
So, did FDR's vision just fail? Was it all too idealistic for a world about to go into the Cold War?
Well, to really understand that, we need to look at how historians have interpreted these events.
So many different perspectives.
4 main schools of thought, each with its own take on FDR's diplomacy and how it all went down. Let's start with those who see FDR in a positive light. The Orthodox school, they were pretty dominant in the early Cold War years.
They loved FDR.
Pretty much. They saw him as this visionary leader. genuinely wanted peace and cooperation with the Soviets.
So, like, he was doing his best in a tough spot.
Exactly. They argued that it was Stalin's fault, his ambitions, that led to the Cold War. They saw FDR as almost a tragic hero, trying to build a better world, but, thwarted by forces beyond his control.
I could see that, but you said this view got challenged later.
It did. In the 60s and 70s, you had the revisionist historians.
Okay, what did they think?
They were much more critical of FDR. They argued that he was naive, especially in his dealings with Stalin.
Like, he didn't see Stalin for what he was.
Right. And they point to his concessions at Yalta, particularly on Poland. They say that paved the way for Soviet control of Eastern Europe.
Yalta as this big betrayal.
Some of them saw it that way, yeah. They felt FDR was too trusting, that he didn't get the true nature of Soviet communism.
So you have these two completely different views.
And then comes a third group, the post-revisionists.
Okay, what's their angle?
They tried to move beyond that good guy, bad guy thing.
Makes sense. It's never that simple.
Right. They argued that the Cold War was less about individual decisions, and more about these bigger historical forces.
The clash of ideologies, communism versus capitalism.
Exactly. Like, that tension was bound to lead to conflict.
So they're saying even if FDR had done things differently.
The Cold War might have still happened.
Wow, they really took a step back and looked at the bigger picture.
They did,
Oh.
trying to place FDR's decisions in a broader context.
And what about that fourth group you mentioned?
Right, the Cold War historians.
So what sets them apart?
They came along more recently, built on the work of those post-revisionists, using newly available archives and, really taking a nuanced look at everything.
New evidence changes things.
It does. They've shown how complex it was. Ideology, geopolitics, domestic politics, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, all contributed to the Cold War.
So 4 different interpretations of the same events. No easy answers then, huh?
Nope. And this brings us back to FDR's stance on imperialism.
Right, that contradiction.
Yeah, condemning European colonialism while the U.S. was expanding its own influence.
Seemed like a blind spot.
It might seem that way, but it's more complicated. FDR genuinely believed that American expansion was different.
How so?
He saw the U.S. as a force for good, spreading democracy and freedom.
And European colonialism.
He saw that as exploitative, oppressive.
Ah, so he believed in that American exceptionalism idea.
Yeah, that definitely played a role.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have to remember the context. The U.S. was young, still figuring out its place in the world.
And then World War II happened.
Exactly. Fighting fascism reinforced this idea that America had a duty to defend democracy.
Even if it meant getting more involved in other countries' business.
Right. But here's the ironic part.
Okay, hit me.
Stalin, master manipulator that he was also good at using that anti-imperialist talk.
He could get what he wanted.
Of course. He presented himself as this champion of liberation, even as he tightened control over Eastern Europe.
So 2 guys talking about freedom but meaning completely different things.
Exactly. And that shared language might have actually created a false sense of understanding between them.
Like FDR didn't quite get the threat Stalin posed.
Possibly. He was so focused on dismantling those old European empires, he might have missed the rise of a new one.
The Soviet one.
Right. And that takes us back to Yalta. That's where these two visions really clashed.
It wasn't just about dividing up territory after the war.
It was about the future. 2 very different ideas about what that future should look like.
Okay, paint a picture for our listeners. Yalta, February 1945. The war's almost over. What's the vibe?
Complex. Tense, even. Relief mixed with this growing awareness that the alliance was falling apart.
Those ideological differences were starting to show.
Definitely. And FDR's health was failing.
He wasn't doing well.
No. He was weak, physically and mentally. Some argue that impacted his judgment at Yalta.
So going into this big meeting, he wasn't at his best.
Some say that.
With all that going on, how did he approach his goals? He really wanted the Soviets in the UN, right?
He did. That was huge for him.
Mm-hmm.
He saw the UN as a way to break from that cycle of war.
Like a fresh start.
Yeah, a global organization where countries could work things out peacefully.
And he knew it wouldn't work without the Soviets.
Right. But to get them in, he had to compromise.
Like with Poland.
Exactly. Stalin wanted to control Poland.
That's where FDR's vision hit a wall.
It did. Churchill fought hard for a free Poland, but FDR was willing to concede.
For the sake of the UN. And to get Soviet help with Japan.
Yeah. It's been debated ever since. Was it a necessary evil or a betrayal?
Tough call.
It is. And then there's the Declaration on Liberated Europe, signed at Yalta.
All about democracy and elections.
On paper, at least.
But Stalin didn't care much for it, did he?
No. He wasn't going to allow free elections in Eastern Europe. That declaration was more symbolic than anything.
Kind of sad, you know? Good intentions, but...
Sometimes diplomacy fails, especially when you're dealing with someone like Stalin.
So we've talked about the compromises FDR made, but he did push back somewhere, right?
He did. Churchill wanted to divide up Europe into spheres of influence.
That percentage agreement thing.
Yeah, the Soviets would control a certain percentage of Eastern Europe.
And FDR said no. Why?
Because it went against everything he believed in. He wanted to move away from spheres of influence.
No more big countries pushing around smaller ones.
Exactly. He was trying to build a different kind of world.
A bold vision. But looking back, was it all just too naive?
That's the question. Did he put too much faith in the UN, in international cooperation?
Especially knowing how the Cold War turned out.
Right. To explore that, we need to talk about another big issue at Yalta.
Okay, what's that?
Soviet entry into the war against Japan.
Ah, right. Why was that so important to FDR?
Well, the U.S. was preparing to invade Japan.
That was going to be brutal.
It would have been incredibly bloody. Bringing in the Soviets could potentially shorten the war, save lives.
So it was partly about saving American lives.
Partly. But there was a strategic angle, too.
Okay, I'm listening.
Roosevelt was worried about Soviet ambitions in Asia. He wanted the U.S. to have a say in what happened after the war.
So he's trying to get their help, but also limit their power.
Tough balancing act.
He had to give something to get something, right?
He did. He recognized Soviet control over parts of Manchuria and some islands.
Pretty controversial back then.
And still debated today. Were those concessions necessary or a sign of naivete?
It's hard to judge, looking back.
It is. FDR's legacy is full of these contradictions, you know. He wanted a more just and peaceful world, but he also made deals with dictators.
He was a pragmatist.
He had to be. It's what makes him so fascinating.
So we've talked about his grand vision, his relationship with Stalin, the compromises at Yalta. But what about the American people? How did FDR explain all this to them?
Good question. We have to look at his final address to Congress.
A month before he died?
Right. In that speech, he makes this powerful case for the United Nations.
Selling it to America.
He is. He talks about the failures of the past, how the U.S. rejected the League of Nations after World War I. He says this time has to be different.
America has to lead.
Exactly. He's saying America has a moral obligation to build a better world.
He's appealing to their better angels.
He is. But it's hard to say how well it landed. You know,
Public opinion at the time.
mixed bag. Some were all for it, this internationalism thing, prevent future wars, spread American values.
The others.
More hesitant, worried about getting tangled up in foreign messes.
And then, of course, FDR's gone. Just a month later.
Leaves Truman holding the bag.
And the world's changing fast.
Rapidly. That whole cooperative spirit FDR was hoping for, fading.
The alliance crumbling.
Tensions with the Soviets rising. Iron Curtain coming down.
So what does Truman do? Stick with FDR's plan or go a different route?
Well, Truman's dealing with a whole different reality.
Things have changed.
They have. He sees what Stalin's doing in Eastern Europe,
Not good.
and he sees it as a direct threat to America, to democracy. He's not so sure about working with Stalin anymore.
So no more personal diplomacy.
Out the window. Truman's all about containment, stopping Soviet influence from spreading.
Okay, how does he do that?
Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, NATO.
Big moves.
Huge shift away from FDR's hopes.
So that's it for FDR's vision then? International cooperation, all that.
It's fading fast. The world's splitting into two sides. The UN, FDR's big hope.
Turns into another battleground.
Kind of, yeah. More about rivalry than actual cooperation. Sad, really.
The thing meant to stop wars becomes part of the problem.
It's an irony, that's for sure. But, you know, the UN did survive.
It's still around.
It did provide a place for dialogue, even when things were really bad. And it was important for decolonization, other global issues.
So even if it didn't stop the Cold War, it still did some good.
Right. And beyond the UN, you see FDR's influence in American foreign policy. That focus on promoting democracy.
Even during the Cold War.
It's there, just took on a more anti-communist flavor.
His legacy adapted.
It did. The Cold War dashed his hopes, but his vision, that belief in diplomacy in these institutions,
It still resonates.
it does, especially today, you know, with all the challenges we face.
Maybe he was a little naive, but you gotta admire his ambition, that hope for a better world.
That's something we could all use a bit more of.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about today. FDR's vision, it's complicated.
It is.
But it teaches us about how messy the world is, about diplomacy, about striving for something better. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.